Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 803, April the 27th, 1987. For those of you who hear World Watchers live from Kazoo, where it emanates, I want to remind you one more time the program begins 1 hour earlier next week. World Watchers is on from 7 to 9 p.m. We start earlier. I don't want you to miss a single minute of the broadcast. The Wall Street Journal has a very long article today about an investigation that's been going on for 5 years in Italy regarding the Vatican Bank and the role it played in the fall of the Italian Banco Ambrosiano. And it seems that the shell companies and the major company in Panama, United Trading, was actually Vatican-owned, and that the scandal of the merging of Banco Ambrosiano with the Vatican Bank, literally having the Vatican just about take it over, Italy's largest bank, had been going on for 10 years, from 1972 to 1982, when Roberta Calvi was murdered in London and the Banco Ambrosiano collapsed. The powers that be were trying to make it look as if the Vatican was on the fringe and didn't have a major role in this entire scandal, but the Italian government, as I say, has been working for many years now investigating their Bahamas branch, the relationship of the Vatican to that, money that was put into subsidiaries, and particularly from Peru, millions of dollars into Panama. Panama has been the center of a lot of intrigue and banking, and how this will connect to a lot of other matters that I've discussed on World Watchers, we will wait and see, but I know that it is a very important link to the way terrorist groups or military dictatorships and fascism are funded. There's a new book out that I read a great part of it this weekend called Hot Money and the Politics of Debt. It's by R.T. Naylor, Associate Professor of Economics from McGill University, published by Simon & Schuster, and on the cover it has a red cover with large letters, What Links the Mafia, the Vatican, the Moonies, the CIA, the cocaine barons, the banks, and you. Hot Money and the Politics of Debt. About all they've left out of there are the Masons, the Israeli Mossad, and the Nazi Martin Bormann connections, those banking connections, which are very, very big. But it looks a little bit like World Watchers to see Mafia, Vatican, Moonies, CIA, and cocaine and banks all on the cover of a very nicely designed book. Nip Tuck and David Emery talk about these interconnecting links very often, and our broadcast probably the only two on the radio in America that give so much time to explain and detail the links of these organizations to each other. One of the kingpins to this book and to all the books regarding Panamanian money, the Vatican, death squads, narcotics traffic and so forth, and relationships to Reverend Moon, the Mafia. One of the big kingpins, of course, is Robert Vesco. He is linked to many of the major actors of the Iran-Contra affair, the investigators of the Iran-Contra affair, the banking connections, and I'll detail maybe one whole broadcast. I could do endless ones on Vesco, and I have many books on Vesco, but he's very much part of that milieu that this book is about. The book goes into the investments of Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano as soon as World War II was over, their role with Batista in Cuba, and in the Bahamas came Robert Vesco with the investment overseas, several $100 million, working with Bernie Cornfeld. And, of course, those are the banks of Mr. Zucker, Willard Zucker, CFR, the accounts of Mr. General Secord and Albert Hakim and Theodore Shackley of the CIA, and the connection of the Swiss banks to Panama is identical to Paul Marcinkus and the Vatican banks in Panama, and all of these people were and have been working together. In fact, in this book, the author describes, before seeking asylum in the Switzerland of Americas, Robert Vesco pondered the state of offshore world. So too did one of his consultants, Richard Allen, who then became National Security Advisor under Ronald Reagan. He describes him as an expert in the emerging law of tax havens and offshore centers, and he was a top aide to Henry Kissinger. Always Kissinger, Haig, and the proteges of Fritz Kramer come into this milieu. And this book goes into Richard Allen and Robert Vesco and their associations, and of course they were closely linked to William Casey, a Knight of Malta, knighted by the Vatican, and it has quite a bit of detail about Mitchell Werbel and Vesco, And I mention it because the book links so many areas together, and Vesco, of course, is tied to the Iran-Contra affair, and he resides, strangely enough, in Cuba, the Cuba of Fidel Castro at the present time. A very good friend of mine passed away just 2 days ago. I've referred to him many times on these broadcasts, Edward Simpson Callis, and he died of cancer. And I met him quite a few years ago when Ray Fabrizio and I were doing a course, 2 courses at MPC on political assassinations, and we learned that Dr. Callis was living in Monterey. Many of you who've been in my home have met him here and his family. He was a psychologist in charge of Sirhan. He was the chief psychologist at San Quentin Prison. When Sirhan was sent there following his conviction for having killed Robert Kennedy, Ed was asked to leave San Quentin or leave the prisoner that he was taking care of, Sirhan, when he recognized that Sirhan had been programmed in a hypnotic state, and that he had the possibility of deprogramming him and working with Sirhan and maybe unfolding the drama of how he got in the Ambassador Hotel while he was there. So Dr. Simpson Callis sent for all the transcripts of the trial and got the transcripts, and is on record for believing that Dr. Diamond, another psychiatrist, had programmed Sirhan to believe that he had killed Robert Kennedy. He moved from the San Francisco area here to Monterey, and after I learned that he was here, as I say, we got to be very good friends. And there are books out on the assassination of Robert Kennedy where there are references to Dr. Simpson Callis. I believe Bill Turner's book mentions him, and there are other books. And I'm not sure of this. I know there was a book, The Manchurian Candidate, that suggested people could be hypnotized to kill political leaders and be triggered off by the sight of something. But I believe Dr. Edward Simpson Callis was the first psychologist in the United States to link the hypnosis and the structuring of the mind of an alleged assassin, particularly killing Robert Kennedy, who wanted to be president of the United States. He was murdered the night of his primary victory. I believe he was the first person to suggest that there was this hypnotized assassin, and one of the few who had the opportunity to work with this person and was very familiar with his case and believed very strongly that Sirhan did not kill Robert Kennedy, that he was programmed, and that if the right people were in touch with him, he could be broken out of the hypnotic state. But anybody who believes that and works with him is not allowed to work with him any longer. And he left working for the prison system at that point. As I say, I moved down here to Monterey. I've been talking the last few weeks about persons arrested, indicted, fascists that are being rounded up, and every week I add a new one. Several weeks ago I added Archbishop Paul Marcinkus and 2 of his Vatican friends who they hide inside the Vatican, waiting for the Italian government to have them delivered by the Pope, which of course he isn't going to do. He's not going to open up that ball of wax. And I referred to the arrest of Reverend Potter Gale, Juan Lopez Rega, Franklin Camper, who was found guilty of firebombing in Los Angeles, Francesco Pazienza, Stefano Della Calle, Carlos Leder Rivas, and Paul Marcinkus and his Vatican buddies who are hiding. Now, this week there's been a trial going on, a long trial, but this week there was an indictment for murder and plotting to overthrow the United States for 15 white supremacists, which is a very interesting case. They've been charged with trying to overthrow our government and of murdering radio talk show host Mr. Berg. Now, the first name in the indictment is Richard Gerndt Butler, 69, of Idaho, a leader of the Aryan Nations Church. And, of course, I've done many broadcasts on this particular person. 9 others are affiliated with the Aryan Nations and groups such as the Order and the Clan. Most of you have seen the indictment. The Order is described as a group put together by William Pierce of Arlington, Virginia. Interestingly enough, he hasn't been indicted. Pierce worked for the Air Force, and he worked for United Technology and took the money from United Technology to start the Nazi Party. He changed the name so it wouldn't appear just as the Nazi Party, and he has a group it's in Arlington, Virginia. He took over from the late Rockwell, who was murdered, who ran the Nazi Party. The person that had killed Robert Kennedy, most of the researchers believe, is Thane Cesar, a man who worked in Burbank and worked on the U2 program and worked with Richard Butler, the same person who's been indicted this week. Thane Cesar has never been really questioned in a court of law. He's been interviewed by Ted Charach, who made a movie with his disgusting statements about blacks and so forth. Thane Cesar was a guard at Lockheed, moonlighting when he was standing behind Robert Kennedy, fell to the ground, let out some bullets out of his gun, and fled. And Sirhan took the rap, and it was Ed Simpson Calas who recognized the fact that it was not Sirhan who had killed Robert Kennedy. So it's interesting that just days apart, or practically on the same day that Dr. Simpson Calas passed away, the person who actually had fired a gun behind Robert Kennedy that was exactly where the autopsy report said the fatal bullet came from, the man, Thane Cesar, worked with his co-partner, the Robert Butler, who went to Idaho and formed the Aryan nations. He went from the U-2 program and the Lockheed Aerospace up to Idaho, and now he has been charged with trying to overthrow the country. Now, his co-partner, by killing Robert Kennedy, assured the position of presidency for Richard Nixon for that 1968 election. And all of the books on espionage of Nixon and Ronald Reagan show that the beginning of turning the National Security Council into a secret private army, removing it from Congress, having its own rules and laws, began as soon as Richard Nixon was assured the presidency, which he wanted in 1960 and lost to President Kennedy. And then Ronald Reagan, when he came into power, continued exactly what Richard Nixon was doing up till the time he was removed because of the Watergate scandals. So it's kind of interesting, I think, in real synchronicity, that Richard Butler has been indicted for murder and planning to overthrow the country, and his cohort down at Lockheed, while he's off, also had the same intentions, and we almost got there. As a matter of fact, I was reading an article this week by Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, who also was a director of the CIA, who feared that Richard Nixon was going to have a military coup in 1972, and that would be consistent with the work of the Aryan nations or the purposes that St. Caesar had for killing Robert Kennedy. And Richard Butler had the same goal and worked with the same people. So there's an overlaying there of much more than just synchronicity. These people have identifiable positions and states of mind and do happen to work together if you study the connecting tissues. And I've done broadcasts on Richard Butler and the Aryan nations and his links to Ronald Reagan in California and Edgar Eugene Bradley and so forth. So a part of our era has gone with a courageous man like Ed Simpson Calas speaking up. No other doctor I know of who's treated an alleged assassin has had the courage to come forward and say these things. Now, I have a long list of articles that I wanted to run through because the Congregate hearings begin next week on May the 6th, but there was one that's a first, and I'm going to spend as much time as necessary to detail this with you because it came over the San Jose Mercury News Washington Bureau, didn't make the wire services, so I know that many of you people that listen to World Watchers and get the tapes are not lucky enough to get their hands on this article, or you get a short version. If you send a self-addressed stamped envelope and 25 cents for copying, I'll send you the full 2-page article because it's 10 by 14, 2 pages, a long story. And as I say, this is a first, again, like Dr. Edward Simpson's Calas coming forward. This is a first by two people who worked with the Defense Department, CIA, and State Department who have come forward to give us a view of working specifically inside the Reagan administration, although what they're talking about has gone on for a long, long time before. The title of the article is Two Claim Firm Did Covert U.S. Jobs. That's the article. It's written by Frank Grieve, Matthew Purdy, and Mark Faziola. It came out San Jose Mercury, April 26, 1987. And I outlined this article for you. These men were from the Pentagon intelligence. They were specialists. And persons inside the Pentagon that worked with them urged them to have a private company formed in Texas that would, and this is quotes, mount several secret operations that they deemed too sensitive for direct government involvement, including the sale of arms for an aborted 1982 plot to kill Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, in political assassination research, people say, well, where's the smoking gun? Where's the paper? Where's the canceled check for the contract? It doesn't work that way at all. The persons who I've studied their murders, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and so forth, there is no signed contract. What happens is that the intelligence community gives to private companies the go-ahead to do things which, these are their words, are too sensitive for direct government involvement. And we see this being a better view of it even during Contra-Iran affair than we got during the Watergate hearings. There was plenty to lead us to that direction, but this is current, and these men worked for Ronald Reagan. The article says the private Texas company officials won clearance from Pentagon officials for the purposes of vigilante-style schemes, and they allegedly were supposed to kill drug smugglers in Peru, Honduras, Belize, and the Caribbean. Now, the cover story is always something very grand, like we want to stop drugs, we want to kill drug dealers, but that's only a passing excuse, because what these people really did was set up death squads in these countries. It wasn't so much for drugs as to divide the money from the drugs, but to kill political persons who were a pain in the neck. I've got to watch these words on the radio now. I usually do pretty good. To kill those persons who are bothering the dictators to assure that the dictators can stay in power, or else they were used to overthrow countries to put the dictators back in power. The private Texas firm is known as, it closed in 1984, as PEREGRINE, P-E-R-E-G-R-I-N-E, PEREGRINE International Associates of Dallas, Texas. A lot of action, of course, takes place in Dallas, Texas. They were encouraged to arm and train Nicaragua Contra rebels. They worked with the elite military commando units in El Salvador, Honduras, and Peru. So you know they weren't after drug dealers, because a big hunk of the drug traffic, if you've been reading your articles lately or continuously since the Iran-Contra arrests, drug havens were in Honduras, El Salvador, and Peru. So they weren't after the drug people. They were setting up elite military commando units. They said, our job was to do the things that the government could not be seen to be doing. That's a quotation of Gary Howard, the founder of PEREGRINE Associates. He said, our deal was that the private sector could handle lots of security missions abroad, and American boys wouldn't get killed, or if they did, there wouldn't be a fuss. And they spell out exactly how the National Security Council Defense Intelligence Agency works, do what the government can't do, and save the Americans, and if a few killed, there won't be any fuss. Now, 243 Marines were killed in Lebanon. Ronald Reagan got no fuss at all. Grenada fatalities, there were 18 Americans dead, 86 wounded, 123 Grenadian citizens killed in a mental hospital that was bombed, 36 Cubans killed, 57 Cubans wounded. Not hardly a whisper from anybody about this slaughter. The TWA hijacking took place, and I have articles you've probably seen it. Maybe I'll have time to go to them. Robert McFarland was meeting with the chief suspect of the TWA hijacking, where an American was killed. And just last week I went into, and I want to do more details on it, the link of the terrorist and Mr. Abbas, who had masterminded the Aquila Laura incident where an American citizen was killed. Nothing happened. He was allowed to leave Italy and do his activities around the Middle East or wherever he wants. And in Pakistan, an American citizen was killed in September 86. Not a word about that, secret trials, and so forth. So what these people can do is handle missions abroad, even agent provocateur events such as, I believe the Berlin Disco was, the TWA, the Aquila Laura. All the time there were incidences and reasons for me to believe they were agent provocateur actions, and then later the national security agents are meeting with these people and working with them, such as Robert McFarland and Oliver North, and nothing is happening. The Americans could be killed, and nobody gets outraged at Ronald Reagan, which is the purpose of using these agent provocateurs and these teams. The article says PEREGRINE's executives believe their firm was the model for what became the Reagan administration's broad policy of carrying out politically unacceptable covert operations off the books. Now, that's their belief that it was the model for the Reagan administration, but they're wrong about that. Ronald Reagan came into a system that was well set up. In the book published by the government, Report to the President by the Commission on CIA Activities Within the United States, published in June 1975, Ronald Reagan was on that commission. And in that book, The Government Investigations, page 250 to 272, there are BS explanations of the Kennedy assassination and the role of E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis. Ronald Reagan said on those reports, June 1975. Now, we're at 1987. There's a current Contragate suit filed by Daniel Sheehan of the Christic Institute versus General Richard Secord of the Pentagon, General John Singlaub, Albert Hakim, CIA agent Thomas Cline, CIA agent Theodore Shackley, for drug running, assassination plots, actual murders, and included in the name of this indictment, and I've had this before, is Frank Fiorini on page 33. Fiorini is Frank Sturgis, the same Sturgis that Reagan was covering up in June of 75, and this is 12 years later. The same guy that Ronald Reagan was using, and as well as other members of the commission, for covert actions. And Fiorini, according to the affidavits, and as I say, I've mentioned this before and I'll keep referring to it, was hired by mobster Santos Trafficante, working for Meyer Lansky, a partner of Robert Vesco, under a private business. The business was Howard Hughes and Hughes Aircraft, the defense contractor. And it was from Hughes Aircraft and Lockheed that were making the U-2 planes together that Thane Cesar came from, the gentleman who worked with Ed Butler of the Aryan nations when Robert Kennedy was killed. My point here is that it wasn't Reagan's policy to use dummy front companies as cover for business, for defense, Pentagon, and CIA, that this has been standard operating procedure since the end of World War II. Wild Bill Donovan and Alan Dulles set up companies and corporations and used existing companies and corporations such as ITT, General Motors, and so forth for espionage activities and the aircraft, particularly Adnan Khashoggi of Contragate fame was a CIA agent who worked with Lockheed and was involved with Lockheed scandals years ago. Now, UN Ambassador Vernon Walters was interviewed in San Francisco. This was August 22nd, 1986, a year ago, and he said rightist dictators are no threat to the United States in Latin America. In other words, if they're not a threat to us, then they're good enough for the people. The question of slavery and economic poverty and no homes, health, or provisions for the native populations isn't his problem. If the dictatorship is good for the United States, it's no threat to us. So this policy of putting in dictatorships began right after World War II, and while the men from PEREGRINE believed that their company was a model for Reagan's administration, Ronald Reagan just was continuing the policy, as I say, that had been going on a long time ago. The article says congressional investigators think that it was a pattern of using retired military personnel in secret contracts of what finally exploded in the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, they in their article say congressional investigators think it was this pattern of using retired personnel. Now, congressional persons have gone along with all of these activities year after year. People who've done research, written books, collected articles and books, so much good material, know that Congress has been part of the covert actions of the, quotes, retired military. They allow Colonel North to work with retired John Singlaub, to work with retired General Secord. These things were in the press for the last 2 and 3 years. The only reason this story broke open wasn't that they located retired military personnel on secret contracts. The reason these hearings are going to take place and the material is broken open, there were 3 reasons, and keep these clear as those monkeys begin investigating, and certainly a lot will come out. There were 3 reasons why they're going to this now. One was what Ronald Reagan referred to as that dirty rag in Lebanon, the newspaper that printed the story about Robert McFarlane and Michael Ledeen bringing weapons for Khomeini and also for former members of the Shah Savak, while Reagan was calling Khomeini number 1 terrorist. The second reason was that Adnan Khashoggi and Mr. Furmark were going to blackmail William Casey of the CIA and the National Security Council because they had put up $10 million for the weapons to Iran, and instead of being paid back, the money was going to the Contras. And the third reason was that Eugene Hassenfuss was shot down in Nicaragua and immediately mentioned the CIA, George Bush, Mr. Gomez-Rodriguez, who's in the news today as working strongly with Oliver North, and he mentioned Mr. Cirillis, who masterminded the explosion of the airplane in the air of Cuba, linked to the CIA when George Bush was CIA director. So the congressional investigators have to fall into the classification of retired military personnel, which is okay. Let them expose as much as they want. The good thing about these incidences that force this open is that gentlemen such as Gary Howard, the founder of PEREGRINE, and his partner Ronald Tucker are willing to talk about their corporation and how the Defense Department works. And that's where we learn about these operations, not from congressional committees' stupid questions, but from people who've been in the inside, such as Daniel Ellsberg telling us about the Pentagon Papers or these gentlemen. The San Jose Mercury article continues, PEREGRINE operated like a private CIA, offering counterterrorist and counterinsurgency assistance to foreign countries. In 1982, they trained a commando group in Honduras. They had instructions in urban assault tactics, interrogation, how to capture suspects, demolition, sniper, and marksmanship. Howard and Tucker, according to this article in the San Jose Mercury, are the first commando entrepreneurs to reveal the secret arrangements with the government, and this is how it worked. These were the men training in Honduras and going to many other countries. They were told where to go to where to stay away from, but they're talking now, and one reason they said they're talking is that the federal government owes them $1.2 million they're not talking about, so they're ready to speak publicly, and that's what happened with Mr. Khashoggi and Mr. Furmark when their measly $10 million didn't come back to them. The allegations made by Howard and Tucker were confirmed, according to these authors, from the customs documents, from State Department records, FBI, customs, and military interviews. Much of the work is still classified. Howard and Tucker said they met all of the time in Washington, D.C. with Pentagon intelligence specialists, and they discussed the proposed missions that they were supposed to do that the government up front couldn't do. They met frequently with retired Army Lieutenant General Samuel V. Wilson, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, currently an advisor to Secretary of the Defense Department Caspar Weinberger on special operations. The man who advised them works for Caspar Weinberger at the present time. Now remember, General Daniel Graham was formerly the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, identical to Samuel V. Wilson. He had the same job. He's now chairman of Coalition for Strategic Defense Initiative. He shares offices with Fritz Kramer of the National Security Council. So these retired General Daniel Graham moves his agent and partner moves the NSC, and retired Army Lieutenant General Wilson, Samuel Wilson, former director of Defense Intelligence Agency, currently works as an advisor to Caspar Weinberger. So when you see the retired general, the former CIA, you know that's just a bunch of BS. And the important thing about this article, that for the first time that is revealing this network, is that I continuously say when people write books or give public lectures and start beating and whipping that old CIA ass, that donkey, just forget about it. Ask them, what about the Defense Intelligence Agency? What about the National Security Council? Because this is the higher echelon that these two men went to from Dallas, Texas, or the people from Washington approach them to do the work. It comes out of the DIA and the NSC and right out of the offices of the Secretary of Defense. These people met a Wayne Long, Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Long. First, Samuel V. Wilson, retired from Defense Intelligence Agency as director. Colonel Long was a senior officer of a top-secret military intelligence unit called Foreign Operations Group, and I'll do more on that later. FOG. Now remember when General Richard Secord retired in 1983 from the Air Force, and I mentioned this before, he remained in a position to oversee covert activities identical to these men. He served on a non-salaried position as a member of the Pentagon in a group called SOPAG, S-O-P-A-G. That was his modus operandi, SOPAG. It consisted of a panel of, retired commando generals to advise Noel Koch. They set up safe houses in London that later worked with Mr. Khashoggi and the Iran arms persons. Koch was Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary in charge of special operations, counterinsurgency, and counterterrorism. So these retired, the word retired I can't say enough. Has nothing to do with being retired. They get themselves off the payroll of the government. So in the event they're caught, the government can have their plausible deniability. We don't know who they are. They used to work for us. We haven't seen them in years. And all they do is change the letterhead of where they go, whether it's FOG or SOPOG, and they're working for the same people with the same bosses, which are Caspar Weinberger and also retired Army Lieutenant General Samuel Wilson of DIA, who's not retired. We'll take a 1-minute break and continue with this story, which is a very important first-time revelation of how the commando entrepreneurs work with the highest echelon right up to the Defense Department. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of World Watchers, program number 803, and I'm detailing for you an article in the San Jose Mercury printed just yesterday, Sunday, the 26th of April, written by Frank Grieve, Matthew Purdy, and Mark Faziola, regarding two gentlemen who set up a corporation in conjunction with the Defense Department, and for the first time, Gary Howard and Ronald Tucker, who managed a company in Dallas, Texas called PEREGRINE, are revealing the modus operandi of how the Defense Department uses private persons to set up agencies and to kill heads of states, such as Ayatollah Khomeini. They weren't successful in that, but we don't know who else they killed. They were training with a lot of commando techniques, and those are for the purpose of killing. Besides meeting with Lieutenant General Samuel Wilson, they met with Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Long. As I said, he was a part of the top secret. He is part of the top secret military intelligence unit called Foreign Operations Group, FOG. Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Long's group was part of Army's intelligence support activity, which is said to work with the Central Intelligence Agency. Long would be the liaison of the defense to the CIA, and it provides intelligence and deep cover laundered money for secret U.S. military missions abroad, which I am sure included Nugan Bank, as well as many of the other banks that Oliver North and the Contra Gate, Iran Gate persons tap into and connect with. General Wilson and General Long told Mr. Howard and Tucker what they could do, what they couldn't do. Gary Howard has been a deputy sheriff in Texas since 1984. Their corporation stopped. PEREGRINE stopped in 1984. All their sanctions came from the term, they used the term mother, which is all-inclusive, and mother meant for them an okay from the State Department, the CIA, and the Defense Department, giving assurance that they wouldn't stand in their way and suggesting what they should do. In the book, The Man Who Kept the Secrets by Thomas Powers, it's a book about Richard Helms. Chapter 8 describes in that book how Richard Helms was so disgusted with the hearings, the Senator Church hearings in 1975 regarding covert actions and political assassinations. And he said, Senator Church kept asking questions of such hypocrisy. He said he understood these things. He said they knew why the written record was so thin. They understood the CIA didn't really care who ran Cuba or Indonesia or the Congo, that they knew that the president alone made the decisions, that when you watch the policies of the upper-level CIA officials, they worked for the president alone, and they never forgot it, and one could infer accurately what the president wanted by paying attention to what the CIA did. And again, the CIA is a major actor, but it goes from the president and the national security to the Pentagon. Then the Pentagon agents introduce these men to Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Long, who's the liaison to the CIA, and it works that way down from General Samuel Wilson and the DIA to Lieutenant Colonel Long, down to the CIA, and Wilson and Long then said things that we tell you are cleared by mother, and that's exactly why Richard Helms was so disgusted at these hearings, because he knew that Senator Frank Church knew the difference. In fact, in the book Who's Who in the CIA, Frank Church is listed there, and they kept trying to bring it out. How much did the president know, again, at the time of Watergate? Where are the orders? Who gave the orders? Where's the piece of paper? And Helms said he had an irresistible urge to yell back at them, Senator, how can you be so GD dumb? You don't put an order like that in writing, Richard Helms said, and that you know by what they do that mother has told them to do it. And these men got a sanction, Mr. Howard and Tucker, from Mother that was all-inclusive, but then has to come out of the White House, the NSC. So the State Department, CIA, and Defense Department say, if Mother says it's okay, like Simon says, it's okay. Now, these men formed this PEREGRINE company and were given approval to kill Khomeini if they could. The plot didn't come through right. It fell apart, but I'm sure the plans are still there if we could get away with it. And they were assisted by active duty special forces personnel, in quotes, on leave again. And they make it quite clear that these are active duty special forces, in quotes, on leave. So if they are involved in killing Khomeini, they are on leave. They're not on a payroll. Again, like General Secord, he's not on the payroll of the Defense Department. They're on leave. And they said that personnel from the elite Army counter-terrorist unit called the Delta Force was the one they worked for, who helped them. Personnel, in quotes, active duty on leave. Their goal was to make enough money through their contracts with foreign governments to keep enhancing their profits. These men were in a business. That's what it was. They could care less about the countries than they as much as say so. Lieutenant Colonel Wong knew PEREGRINE and some of their officials, the one from the Delta Force, and he took them to the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, or the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, and that's how they began connecting. PEREGRINE firm drew most of its staff, according to this article, from an exotic professional circle, a pool of, again, retired Special Forces personnel familiar with secret military operations, veterans from the Delta Force counter-terrorist unit, in quotes, retired, and this runs through the whole article that they were active duty, in quotes, retired. Howard and Tucker are West Texas lawmen. In 1981, before they formed this company, they worked for U.S. Customs Service from 1979 to 81, and their undercover work, their experience involved infiltrating illegal international arms deals, and they, as a reward, kept a percentage of it, and they were able to save $1.65 million. They sold a Boeing 707 of an arms dealer. That was their cut, and so they formed their company in 1981. Now, the year they formed their company and worked with the Defense Intelligence Agency and the assistant of Caspar Weinberg, again, of course, was the year that Ronald Reagan was president and began to escalate all these activities that are getting them in trouble today. The company's mission changed in 1981 as soon as it was incorporated. Government officials said you won't work on customs anymore, and then they were introduced to, again, a retired, in quotes, retired, who takes them to the Defense Department, Army Special Forces Major Richard J. Meadows, highly decorated Vietnam War commando who worked with General Singlaub and Secord and Oliver North and Theodore Shackley and Thomas Cline. Mr. Eugene Hassan was the same gang from Vietnam. This team was set up in 1981 by Special Forces Major Richard J. Meadows. Meadows was hired then as the president of PEREGRINE's company. He was on the cover of Newsweek after slipping in Tehran in 1980, providing key intelligence for the failed rescue mission in Iran. Notice how many characters involved in allegedly trying to get the hostages out failed, thus assuring the presidency of Ronald Reagan and disgracing Jimmy Carter and having some of the Delta Force. They died out on the desert. Those circumstances were mysterious from the beginning, and he also was part of that rescue mission, so he worked hand in glove with the Contra-Iran persons, although they're not mentioned in this article except in one conjunction. Meadows arranged from his offices, this important person, retired Army Special Forces, arranged to meet his friend and mentor, Lieutenant General Wilson. He was the one, Mr. Meadows, who took these gentlemen to meet the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the current advisor to Caspar Weinberger, and Wilson had ideas for this company which involved, in quotes, he said, doing things that the government could not seem to be doing. Now, again, that's a quotation from a gentleman who works under Caspar Weinberger at the present time. The laws, the opinions, the morality of this country is worth nothing. Do what we couldn't admit we were doing and couldn't be seen doing. That is what they told him. The plans were laid out in Virginia that PEREGRINE would become a private arm of the Army intelligence. The firm would develop plans for training foreign military groups, battling terrorism, and they would still, if they want, pursue arms, undercover arms and narcotics work. Well, you know how they stopped the drug traffic in the countries where they worked. Peregrine, according to these men, was a model after British intelligence. There's a firm in London called Meany, and you might have seen it in the Tower reports and the articles that came out. Oliver North, in his safe organizational papers, has a three initials with quotation marks KMS that mean Keeny Meeny, and I meant to do some broadcasts on it, but there's always so much news. Keeny Meeny is a Swahili word for a snake moving in the grass. And London has their own private army called the Keeny Meenies, and they're employed by British intelligence to do exactly what the others do in this country, to unofficially do operations that the official British presence would be embarrassed by if they were exposed. And if they're arrested, one of the rules of the Keeny Meenies in London is that they're on their own. And that was a British firm that Oliver North hired. He used the Keeny Meenies in Honduras and trained Central American fighting teams. And Oliver North paid them. And Peregrine, set out by the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Delta Force and Special Forces, was the American model of the Keeny Meenies. Now, when Eugene Hasenfuss landed in Nicaragua, he sort of broke the mold, because the Keeny Meenies and North's group and all of these covert actions under the guise of private parties, yet headed by the Defense Department, are always told, if you are arrested, you're on your own. Hasenfuss broke the mold. He began to blab right away, and he mentioned George Bush, and he mentioned Mr. Gomez-Rodriguez and Mr. Cirillis. And, of course, the United States government immediately had to send former Attorney General Griffin Bell down to release Mr. Hasenfuss. It was very nice that they let him out. Bell, I mentioned before, is the attorney and was president or is on the board of E.F. Hutton. And E.F. Hutton is one of the major repositories, or was, for the drug traffic, the cocaine money that went from not only from Italy, the pizza connections from the Medellin cartel, the cocaine connections, and, of course, I've said George Bush's brother-in-law, Scott Pierce, until just a few weeks ago was president of E.F. Hutton when all this drug money was being poured in there. So it was very important that Mr. Hasenfuss catch a good lawyer. He got a good lawyer in Griffin Bell, the former attorney general, and for all purposes, and as I say, I don't know why they released him so quickly. There must going to be some favors for the Nicaraguan government. I can't believe why they would release Mr. Hasenfuss so fast, but he certainly wasn't of the same ilk as the Keeny Meenies. He started to squeal, but it paid off because he got out and he refused to be on his own. This article says that after the Washington meetings with Lieutenant Colonel Long, he provided the list of countries where Peregrine could and could not operate, and they were encouraged to work in the following countries. And one of the values of these people is that they can kill the opponents to the leaders of this country or help overthrow the countries. They were encouraged to work in Belize, in Chile, wipe out the opponents of Pinochet, in Costa Rica, where the Contras are, in El Salvador, helping the death squads get rid of the radicals or the land reform persons, in Guatemala, where the death squads continue, in Honduras, which is the haven for our intelligence community's war against Nicaragua. With the Nicaragua Contras, they trained to work in Morocco, in Nigeria, to kill the revolutionary or the labor persons objecting to that country. And the United States has recently literally taken over Nigeria. In Paraguay, to assist Mr. Stroessner, to kill his opponents. In Peru, in Somalia, and Sudan. Those were where they were encouraged to work. And Peregrine agents were used as a cover, they said, for the United States government. Now, I know that Robert Brown, who publishes Soldier of Fortune, sends out mercenaries who are hired to do the job, such as Peregrine, and that Soldier of Fortune, managed and funded originally by John Singlaub, General Singlaub, and General Adderholt, is, again, a cover for the federal government. Singlaub is in and out of the Defense Department, the National Security Council, and under the guise of private money, as you're seeing, arms were being sent. When Congress says no, they say yes. So this agency set up in Dallas is one of many companies, and they said they believe they're one of many companies for the purposes they were doing. They knew that retired Army Special Forces Major Meadows, hired by Peregrine, they said, reported to Lieutenant General Edwin Wilson, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, working for Caspar Weinberg at the present time, and Mr. Meadows, Army Special Forces Major Meadows, reported to Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Long's group, which is the Army's intelligence support activity working with the CIA. So out of a private office in Dallas, Texas, the man who came in to manage it, Major Richard J. Meadows, reported directly to the assistant to Caspar Weinberger and to Colonel Wayne Long, who was a liaison to the CIA. Peregrine's mission for the Defense Department was shaped by, in quotes, the retired Army Special Forces majors who Meadows hired for the firm to help him run the country. He brought in Major Charles Odorizzi, former Director of Selection and Training for Delta Forces, and Major William Patton, a Latin American specialist. Peregrine used both retired and, they said, active duty personnel on leave. So it's, whether they call it retired or active on leave, they use them for what they called guns. And guns were persons that they hired who they said had no qualms about blowing people away. And if you read Gung Ho or Soldier of Fortune or Eagle, some of those magazines, you know that those same people have no qualms. It's a perfect place to recruit persons who have no problems with blowing people away. They said some of these activities would normally be prohibited under U.S. law, and they keep reasserting this, how they're working outside the U.S. law, but they're working with persons that report directly to what you would think were law-abiding citizens in Washington, D.C., but certainly are not at all. The U.S. military is a law unto itself. I've said this during the 23 years of research that I've done, going back to the period particularly after World War II, or even the illegal rearming of Germany, which was against the law in Germany, which was done by America and the German army, but looking the other way while the Freikorps were taking power and killing off opponents to political systems, opponents to fascism, and so forth, paving the way for Adolf Hitler. This is identical to that kind of a system, using the guns. People have no qualms about killing, going overseas to recommended countries to either keep the dictatorship in power or getting rid of the person who is in power. They said our idea was to be like Delta and not leave anybody alive. If we found a communist cadre or terrorist cells in Honduras or whatever, the whatever is whatever, we'd eliminate them except for the people we want to interrogate or bring back for display, and then, of course, that involved torture and the display of heads cut off and hands cut off and so forth. The men said the most dramatic mission that Long and Wilson of the Defense Department urged was the original plan to kill Khomeini and overthrow the government, and the details of the plot are written up in September 1982, a Customs Service report on an investigation of an illicit arms sale. In 1982, this Meadows of the Defense Department, who's the president of the company, met in London with an Iranian Air Force Major Masoud Yahya, Y-A-H-Y-A, and they were arranging small arms, explosives, ammunitions, so forth to kill Khomeini, but the plan fell through. It collapsed. The operations of Peregrine were eventually replaced by the Central Intelligence Agency, and it was no longer, their operation no longer continued for some reason or other. From 1981 to 1984, they were working for the government. I have my feelings about why it switched in 1984, but they were replaced, and when Oliver North came in and took over his position in the National Security Council after attending the War College, the Navy War College, and working under Ronald Reagan, Reagan had been reelected as president and took 49 states, and then he started using active duty special forces personnel, according to them, disguised as civilians, training Honduran commandos with counterinsurgency techniques. And Howard and Tucker were also planning to send weapons to Peru. An interesting thing is, in the article, they say they wanted to send spare parts to Peru for the leftist Shining Path. There were Eastern Bloc military hardware. And I keep saying how Oliver North and General Secord were shipping Eastern Bloc weapons from Poland and Eastern Europe down to Honduras and to the Contras. And Mr. Hassenfuss had weapons from the Soviet Union on his plane when it went down. And these people wanted to supply the Shining Path Eastern Bloc military hardware. Well, of course, the reason is, as they are killed or left behind, you find these Soviet weapons, and you can show how important Russia is to Central and South America, and that all of these terrorists are using Russian weapons, and that's why we're there in the first place. Now, October 1982, Major Richard Meadows of the Special Forces left Peregrine, and according to this article, the reason he left remains mysterious, But in June 82 is when the Banco Ambrosiano scandal broke wide open. The P2 scandal broke in 1981 in late May and June of 81. And Roberta Calvi was hung in June of 82 in London. And a lot of things changed and happened at that particular time. Those 3 weeks in 1982, I detailed almost every day for 3 weeks on World Watchers the events that were happening, because a lot of changes were going to take place after June of 1982. And it may be that the funds and the connections had to be dried up. Just as I began the program with the Wall Street Journal story of the Vatican Bank and their Panama fronts, which the Vatican actually did control. And here's a new book out on the Vatican Moon Mafia CIA. And Robert Vesco had a lot of investments down there in Panama, and it is a nest for espionage and offshore funding and tangled accounts whereby a lot of these people could bump into each other. And maybe this is one reason Major Meadows left quickly in the fall of 82. There had to be financial shifts that affected a lot of different people. He told Howard and Tucker he would help them form a new company, but he didn't. And then Major Charles Odorizzi, former director of selection and training of Delta Force, suddenly resigned, and the operations officially stopped in 1984. And as I say, that's when North moved into the National Security Council, when North could tap into the AFL-CIO operations in South America or the banks in Switzerland. He could pull from the team that he worked with in Vietnam, General Secord, Thomas Clines, and then pull in Stanford Technology with Albert Hakim and Theodore Shackley and General John Singlaub. What happened was that this old earlier team that had worked together in Laos, they had worked at the Bay of Pigs, they'd been in Vietnam, in Iran, and Chile. What happened was that companies, maybe others exactly like this PEREGRINE that we don't know about, all collapsed in 1984 as North combined his energy with the team that William Casey had worked with for a long, long time, even going back to the OSS days and right at the end of World War II, and the team that was involved actually with the drug traffic, gun running, political assassinations, so that this private company was no longer needed and this team was more secure. It was 1983 when General Secord left the Air Force, left in quotes, to go to Stanford Technology with Albert Hakim. That network set up by the original TCI, by Otto von Bolschwing, IIS company being taken over by Hakim and Secord. So I believe that many of these small companies were dumped on the side as they took the tried and trusted team, and they would have stayed together today if it hadn't have been for the Journal in Lebanon, probably for Hassan Faz landing, for Khashoggi and Furmark wanting their money. They may still be operating as they have for a long time, but circumstances came in and interrupted their operations, and now the team that replaced PEREGRINE and their associates, or many like them, has been pushed aside, and they are open for investigation. Now, there are so many important articles leading up to Irangate. I just want to mention a few of them that were in the news just recently. I can't detail some of them, but some I will outline in the future. But running them down quickly, I want to remind you of an article in the Salt Lake Tribune. This was February the 8th, 1987. Under Foreign Briefs report, Hamadi, Hamadi, and McFarlane had talks last year. In Bonn, West Germany, former U.S. National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane had talks in Beirut last year with a suspected Lebanese hijacker wanted by the United States. Quoting U.S. security sources, it said McFarlane met the wanted man Mohammed Ali Hamadi while on a secret mission trying to get the release of the hostages. Hamadi was arrested in Frankfurt, Germany, January the 13th, 1987. Arriving from Beirut, the United States wants to try him on charge of murder and air piracy coming from the hijacking of the TWA plane in Beirut in 1985, where an American passenger was killed. Robert McFarlane of the NSC working with a person who is wanted for setting up the hijacking and the murder of an American citizen in Beirut. Another long article, these I can't break down. It would take an entire program for each of them. I'm going to read you mostly the titles because they're on pages 10 by 14. Again, they're not single little items, they're long stories. This one is titled Pilot. I flew arms in and pot out. This is an article April the 6th, 1967 from Newsday, written by Newt Royce, and it tells about bringing in tons of pot, pounds of pot, tons of pot, working with Max Gomez-Rodriguez, again, the contacts of George Bush, through his longtime associate Donald Gregg. And this person who told this story was the subject of a CBS report also of Max Gomez-Rodriguez and Gregg and the gun running and Cece Quintero and the narcotics trafficking coming in from Central America, the weapons going over to them and the narcotics coming out. There have been many long articles on that. Our Attorney General is under some kind of surveillance or questioning finally. It's long overdue. April the 9th, 1987, Washington Post has a long story. Misa's testimony raises new questions. And, of course, this goes into his relationship with FBI agent Oliver Buck Rebel, with William Webster, who still has not been confirmed as CIA director. And this has to do with Misa stalling the investigations, taking orders literally from Admiral Poindexter, the National Security Advisor, to stay away from Southern air transport. And these writers now, Walter Pincus and many others, are writing long, long stories of the relationship of the Attorney General Ed Meese. He's also involved with a corporation, and his longtime buddy Lynn Nofsiker and his silent or secret trust fund, his agents representing his money, are sitting on the board of a company under criminal investigation. That's how his secret trusts operate. Another long article, April the 12th on Sunday. I briefly mentioned this before. Reagan aides in 1980 held hostage talks. And this is about persons in Iran working with Reagan's top aides, promising or suggesting that they hold up the hostages until Reagan is elected president of the United States. And it involves Richard Allen. Many of you have seen this article. This is from the Miami Herald, Alfonso Charity. It was in the San Jose Mercury. And if you don't have either of those papers, I will outline and detail that for you. The scandal of stealing the elections is one of the big stories they probably won't touch with Contragate, but is very, very important. Another article that most people should share and probably don't have is from the People's Daily World, April 14th, 1987. Wanted, murderers for CIA drugs and for gun deals, written by Tom Wheeler. And it came out of Willamette Week, a Portland, Oregon newspaper that said the CIA was recruiting known murderers and drug dealers for a project in Central America called Jamestown Project. And one of the persons they hired had a murder conviction in 1960, and the reason they went to him is they said they want to know that he can do it if he has to, do the killing. And this is a long article about Oliver North and his private operations on the side, using private financiers to put up money to supply networks and arms and trading for drugs. And it has to do with using a known killer or two or three for necessary jobs. Again, think of the guns that were hired in that other article I just shared with you. And this has to do with a company in Las Vegas, a consulting firm called Irwin Pardue and Associates. And the job was under Project Director Central America. They would paid $3,000 a month, plus $75 offshore per diem. And I'll detail this for you. This is wanted murderers, known murderers, to work for the CIA. Another long article out of Newsday that I briefly touched last week, Syrian drug dealer linked to North Arms Network. And a friend sent me the entire article from Newsday. It was reprinted in part in the San Jose Mercury. This one's by Newt Royce, and this has to do with Mr. Secord and Oliver North working with a multi-millionaire, Manzar al-Qassar. He's from Syria, and he supplies the arms for Abbas, the man who masterminded the Achille Laura hijacking, and where, again, another American was killed, and Abbas enjoys the prominent position of floating around with the various arms dealers and radicals in the business of supporting PLO and terrorism throughout the Middle East. This is a long story from Newsday, and I will detail that for you. Another one, terror suspect dealt in Contra Arms linked to reputed terrorists. This is a similar article to the one based upon the Newsday article about Oliver North and General Secord and the relationship to the terrorists in the Middle East and Achille Laura. Another story from the San Francisco Examiner, April 21st, sources tell of CIA's Contra drug smuggling links. And again, this is an update of one that came out different than the one April the 6th. In exchange for help in arming the Contras, the CIA helped Miami-based drug smugglers move their cargo into the United States from Central America. And this again goes into Mr. Morales, who said this was George Bush's baby, and Bush's name comes throughout all of these articles. It'll be interesting to see what develops in the Contra-Iran story and investigation as the people come forward in these operations and are willing to give more details. Besides Attorney General Edwin Meese being under the fire, Mr. Webster, the FBI director who wants to be CIA director, is also mentioned in many long articles. One in the Washington Post, April the 9th, 1987, how Webster had warnings about Oliver North, how he forgot the October memo, how he ignored the Contra data and withheld information about Oliver North. My time is up, and I would like to list for you about 20 or 30 of the very important articles coming out, but we don't have time, and I felt it was more important to describe that little private organization worked up by Caspar Weinberg and the Defense Department to show how they kill and send the killers and disassociate themselves from the agencies that the United States government have set up, but work inside the agencies. Of course, we'll be doing more on Iran-Contra for years to come, but in the meantime, that's all we can do this week. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you some more next week to continue along the lines of watching these killers and assassins being exposed finally for what they really are.